I want you to imagine for just a second that you are stepping off a creaking, just incredibly overcrowded wooden ship,
Yeah.
and you're stepping right into the absolute mud and chaos of San Francisco in 1849.
Just a total mess of a place.
Right, exactly. You have somehow survived this brutal, month-long ocean journey. You push your way through the thick fog, you step onto the docks, and you look around at this exploding gold rush boomtown.
Hmm.
And almost immediately, you notice a demographic imbalance that is so extreme, it barely even looks like a real human society.
Really didn't.
I mean, out of roughly 40,000 immigrants who arrived by sea that
It
year,
was a huge number.
massive.
Yeah.
But out of those 40,000, only about 700 of them were women.
Yeah, it's a statistical reality that is genuinely difficult for us to process today. I mean, you are looking at a frontier built practically overnight, composed almost entirely of desperate men hunting for fortune.
Right.
It was a society that was completely devoid of traditional Victorian structure.
And that wildly skewed society sets the stage for, well, a really fascinating historical mystery.
Oh, absolutely.
Because decades later, when researchers started digging into United States Census records,
Right, looking at the years from 1880 all the way up to 1950.
exactly, they uncovered this massive statistical illusion. A staggering number of people across the country, specifically women, answered the census takers' marital status question by claiming they were widowed.
Hmm.
But here is the incredible catch. A huge percentage of their spouses were actually still alive.
Yeah, they were out panning for gold or just starting new lives out west.
So on paper, if you just glance at the data, it looks like this tragic nationwide epidemic of early mortality.
Right, but if you look at the actual human behavior behind those census takes, it was something entirely different. It was a survival tactic.
And uncovering that tactic is our mission for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We are taking your sources, genealogical records, historical essays, and 19th century legal notes, and we're using them to explore the really jarring, often terrifying legal realities for women in the 1800s.
Because it's a stark contrast.
Totally. We're going to contrast the suffocating conventional wisdom of the Victorian era back east with the lawless, completely imbalanced society of Gold Rush San Francisco.
Right.
Our goal here is to understand the oppressive laws that literally erased women from the public record, the bizarre legal superpowers granted to the single woman, and the incredibly ingenious extra-legal workarounds that married women invented just to keep their children fed.
Because to understand why a mother would stand on her front porch, look a federal census taker in the eye, and just lie about her husband being dead,
Right.
you first have to understand the legal machinery that forced her into that position.
Okay, so let's unpack this,
Yeah.
because I really want to understand the mechanics of this machinery. From what I'm reading in the source material, getting married in the 19th century wasn't just a social contract or like a religious ceremony. It was a literal erasure of your personhood.
Yeah, erasure is actually the most accurate way to describe it. To understand how this worked, we have to look at the foundation of English common law, specifically a legal doctrine known as coverture.
Okay.
Now, this was not some new, conservative Victorian concept invented in the 1800s. Its origins trace all the way back to the 11th century.
Wait, really? The 11th century?
Yeah, following the Norman invasion of England.
I am struggling to reconcile that timeline, honestly. We are talking about laws forged in the 1000s,
Yep.
like when knights were riding around in chainmail, and those laws are dictating how a woman could live in an industrialized American city in the 1800s.
Precisely. I mean, the Normans brought with them a concept rooted in feudalism. It comes from the French term covert baron. And the underlying logic was all about consolidating property and power. The state, the king, they wanted to deal with one head of household for taxes, military drafts, that sort of thing.
Right, keep it simple for the tax collector.
Exactly. So the law declared that by marriage, the husband and wife became one single person in the eyes of the law.
Wow.
And crucially, that one person was the husband. The very being, the entire legal existence of the woman was completely suspended for the duration of the marriage. She was legally incorporated into him.
So she became a femme covert, a covered woman.
Yes, exactly.
Let me try to visualize how this actually functioned day to day.
Mhm.
The sources used a hostile corporate takeover analogy.
Which is a good one.
It is, but it doesn't quite capture the physical reality of it for me. To me, it feels a lot more like a legal ventriloquist act.
Oh, that's interesting. How so?
Well, the state only recognizes one voice, one physical body. The husband is the ventriloquist, and the wife is legally muted, treated merely as an extension of her. The state doesn't even see her sitting there.
That is a much better way to conceptualize it, actually, because it highlights the utter lack of agency.
Right.
Because the restrictions were absolute. A married woman could not sign a lease for an apartment. She could not make a legally binding will. She couldn't initiate a lawsuit if she was wronged.
Wait, really? Not at all.
Not at all. If she was physically injured by, say, a business owner, she couldn't sue them. Her husband had to sue them for the quote-unquote loss of his wife's services.
That is insane.
And any property she owned the day before the wedding instantly belonged to him the moment they said, "I do."
Think about what that means for you as a listener if you were living back then. Imagine spending a month hand-sewing garments, right? Taking them to a market, selling them. The shopkeeper legally could not hand the money to you. Your daily wages belonged entirely to your husband.
Completely.
Which becomes utterly terrifying when you introduce the concept of a dissipated husband.
Right. Dissipated was the polite Victorian catch-all term.
Meaning what exactly?
It usually meant a man prone to chronic drunkenness, gambling, womanizing, or just general financial ruin.
So, if you are married to a dissipated man, and he takes the wages you just earned doing laundry and gambles them away at a saloon,
You have absolutely zero legal standing to stop him.
you can't separate your bank account.
We don't even have a bank account. You can't have one.
Wow.
And the logic of coverture extends to the darkest possible corners of family life, too. Under this doctrine, even the children legally belonged entirely to the husband.
As property.
Essentially, yes. He was viewed as the sole owner of the family assets, and children were considered assets. He had total, unquestionable authority over their religion, their education, their upbringing.
God.
If a marriage fractured, a judge physically could not award a mother custody of her own kids because legally they were his property.
Which just exposes the massive, cruel hypocrisy of the entire Victorian era.
Oh, absolutely.
You read the conduct manuals and the poetry of the time, and the conventional wisdom was constantly telling women that their ultimate divine role was to make the home a sacred shelter from the harsh outside world.
Yeah, it's a fascinating cognitive dissonance. Moralists endlessly praised a woman's ennobling influence in the domestic sphere. But the legal framework, which was drafted exclusively by men who denied women the right to vote, allowed that sacred shelter to function as a literal prison.
Because she couldn't leave.
Right. Courts legally permitted a husband to forcibly confine his wife to the home if she tried to leave. He was allowed to physically chastise her to maintain order, and if she wanted out, divorce was virtually impossible.
Okay, so if marriage was essentially a legally sanctioned trap, how did any woman escape it?
Well,
Because the sources point to an ultimate rebellion. If saying I do meant being legally erased, the only logical way to retain your power was to refuse the ring altogether.
and that is the paradox of 19th century law. Under the exact same common law system, a single woman, like a spinster, a widow, anyone who was unmarried, was classified as a femme sole. Literally, a woman alone.
And reading about the femme sole is like reading about a glitch in the Matrix.
It really is.
How differently was she treated compared to the muted ventriloquist dummy we just discussed?
Night and day. A femme sole possessed the exact same legal rights as a man. It is that simple,
Really? Just by being single?
just by being single.
Huh.
Because she had no husband to, quote-unquote, cover her, the state had to acknowledge her existence. She could acquire and manage her own real estate. She could take out loans and assume debts.
Wow.
She could enter into binding business contracts, make a will, sue people in her own name. The state recognized her complete legal autonomy.
Which sets up this explosive dynamic when we shift our focus back to the mud and the madness of San Francisco.
Yeah, let's go back there.
Let's look those numbers again. By 1853, the population of San Francisco had swelled to about 50,000 inhabitants. Out of those 50,000, there were roughly 8,000 women.
Wow.
And only 300 children.
The ratio alone tells a profound story. With only 300 children among 8,000 women, you know immediately that these women were largely not fulfilling the conventional Victorian roles of wives and mothers sitting in parlors.
Right.
They were part of the workforce.
And what a workforce it was, because almost all the men were running off to the Sierra Nevadas to swing pickaxes in the gold fields. Basic domestic labor was in desperately short supply.
Huge shortage.
If you were a single woman who made it to California, your specific skill set was suddenly worth its weight in gold. You had immense economic leverage.
They immediately filled the vacuums in the infrastructure. Many single women ran lucrative boarding houses, which gave them a steady income and independence.
Yeah.
Others operated bathhouses. They worked as seamstresses, domestic servants, laundresses. Keep in mind, this was brutal, back-breaking labor.
For sure.
In fact, by 1855, Chinese immigrants had largely taken over the laundry business in the city, performing the grueling, intensely physical work that white American men simply scorned and refused to do.
But we cannot talk about the economy of a city composed of 42,000 men and 8,000 women without addressing the elephant in the room.
Prostitution.
Yeah, prostitution wasn't just prevalent. According to the sources, it was a foundational pillar of the early San Francisco economy.
It was incredibly lucrative.
Hmm.
And what is entirely unique about this specific window in history is the social standing these women temporarily held.
Right, because of the scarcity.
Exactly. In the very early years of the gold rush, prostitutes were treated with a curious sort of reverence by the male population. They were often the sole leaders of high society, bringing what one historian described as a certain grace and gaiety to a bleak, violent town.
It's so bizarre to think about.
It is. The newspapers and polite society used these elaborate euphemisms for them, referring to them in print as ladies in full bloom or the fair but frail.
Ladies in full bloom. I mean, the mental gymnastics required to use a phrase like that while navigating mud-filled streets is just astounding.
It really is.
And the desperation for any female presence led to scenarios that sound like pure fiction. Like, the sources mention a grand ball hosted by the monumental engine company Big Six.
Oh, the legend of the 500 ladies.
Yes.
It perfectly encapsulates the frenzy of the era.
Exactly. So the story goes that this fire engine company wanted to throw a legitimate high society ball.
Yeah.
So they made a strict East Coast style rule. No gentleman could enter the ballroom unless accompanied by a lady.
Which is a tough rule in 1849 San Francisco.
Right. How do you enforce that in a city of bachelor minors? According to the myth, polite society was so determined to hold this event that they supposedly ransacked the entire Western Territory. And rumors flew that they hired the Pony Express to bring 500 ladies from as far away as St. Joseph, Missouri, just to have dance partners for one night.
Yeah, and whether the logistics of that Pony Express story are entirely factual or heavily embellished by history, the core truth remains.
The scarcity.
Right. The skewed demographics completely obliterated traditional Victorian social norms. The scarcity of women gave them a bizarre, unprecedented social elevation.
But I want to pause here because I'm trying to reconcile the legal reality with the social reality.
Okay.
Are we actually concluding that an unmarried woman washing clothes or running a saloon in lawless San Francisco possessed more systemic legal power than a wealthy, highly respected, aristocratic married woman sitting in a mansion in Boston?
Mechanically speaking.
Yes.
That is wild.
The wealthy aristocrat in Boston was a femme covert. She may have had social privilege, sure, but she was entirely legally subordinate to her husband. She didn't own the mansion. She didn't own her jewelry.
Wow.
While the working single woman in San Francisco was a femme sole. She was a legally independent agent. She owned her profits, she signed her own leases, and she controlled her own destiny.
That is a staggering contrast, but it leaves us with a massive, glaring problem. What about the women who were married?
Specifically, the thousands of wives left behind when their husbands caught gold fever, abandoned their jobs, and headed west to seek their fortune.
And this is where the legal machinery of coverture becomes a literal death trap.
Mm-hmm.
When these men abandoned their families, often leaving to escape the drudgery of home life or bad debt, they didn't take the legal doctrine with them.
Right.
The wives were left behind, but they were still femme covert.
Imagine being in that situation. Your husband has vanished into the West. You have 3 kids to feed. You want to sell a parcel of land your family owns to buy groceries. But legally you can't because the state says the man who abandoned you still owns it.
You can't do anything.
You try to get a loan to start a bakery, but the bank turns you away because you have no legal right to sign a contract?
You are paralyzed. You are bound to a ghost.
But consider the obvious alternative. Why not just go to a judge and file for divorce? If he abandons you, doesn't the contract break?
Well, in our modern framework, yes. But in the 1800s, divorce was exclusively fault-based, and it was notoriously difficult to obtain.
You couldn't just say he left.
No, you couldn't just cite irreconcilable differences or even abandonment in many cases. You had to prove severe, undeniable misconduct, like adultery. And often you had to do this in open court, sometimes requiring an act of the state legislature.
That sounds expensive.
Prohibitively expensive. But worse than the cost was the social ruin. The sources explicitly describe divorce in this era as a scandal and severe humiliation.
Yeah.
A divorced woman was viewed with deep suspicion by her community. She became a social pariah, entirely unmarriageable and unemployable.
But being a widow,
Being a widow is a completely different story. Widowhood carried immense social respectability.
because it wasn't your fault.
Exactly. It meant you had fulfilled your Victorian duty, and fate had simply dealt you a tragic blow. There was no shame. Furthermore, becoming a widow instantly reverted your legal status back to a feme sole.
So you regained your legal autonomy.
Yes. You could also access marriage-based entitlements, like military pensions from previous wars.
And here is where the absolute brilliance of human survival kicks in. These women realized that they were trapped in a legal maze with no exit, so they just stepped out of the maze entirely.
They really did.
They bypassed the courts. If a husband vanished to California, creating what historians first called grass widows and later gold rush widows, the husband had essentially engaged in self-divorce.
Right. He used the massive unmapped geography of the United States to just disappear.
And the wives responded with equal ingenuity. Instead of starving while waiting for a man who was never coming back, an abandoned wife would simply pack up her belongings, move a few counties over, or to an entirely new state where no one knew her,
Put on a black dress.
put on a black dress,
Okay.
and don the widow's mask.
Yeah,
It is 19th century identity theft.
it is.
But instead of stealing a stranger's identity to commit fraud, these women were forging a new, socially acceptable version of their own lives. They were performing grief just to feed their children and re-enter society without a scarlet letter.
It was an act of profound necessity. By claiming widowhood, she successfully bypassed coverture. She could sign a lease for a storefront, she could protect her wages,
It's brilliant.
and the widow's mask was also utilized to hide illegitimacy. If an unmarried woman became pregnant, the social consequences were devastating.
Right. Total outcast.
But if she moved to a new town and claimed her brave husband had tragically died of cholera on the Oregon Trail, she provided a highly respectable explanation for her child.
But wait, didn't this open them up to massive legal risk if they decided to remarry? I mean, their husband might still be alive somewhere.
Technically, yes, it was bigamy. If your husband was secretly alive, panning for gold in Sacramento, and you married a shopkeeper in Ohio, you were breaking the law.
Big time.
Bigamy was a felony that carried severe penalties, including imprisonment. But for a working-class woman in the 1800s, having a male partner was often a strict economic necessity for survival. So they relied on mobility, distance, and discretion.
Now, I know there was one actual legal pathway they could have tried to use to declare a missing husband dead. The 7-year rule. How did that work?
Well, courts recognized that people went missing. So they developed a presumption of death. If a spouse had been absent and completely unheard from for 7 consecutive years, a judge could legally declare them dead.
7 years is a long time.
It is. And to get this ruling, the abandoned wife had to prove she had a genuine belief that her husband was dead, and she had to demonstrate to the court that she had made reasonable efforts to locate him.
I'm trying to picture how that actually works in practice. How do you prove reasonable effort in 1852?
You really can't.
You can't text him. You can't hire a private investigator to scour a lawless mountain range 3,000 miles away.
The communication infrastructure was practically non-existent. A letter could take months if it arrived at all.
Right.
And that is exactly why so many women didn't bother waiting a grueling 7 years or enduring a humiliating court process trying to prove they looked for a man they actively didn't want to find.
Makes sense.
They just moved, claimed the widow title on the census, and got on with the business of surviving.
Which brings us full circle to the census illusion we talked about at the beginning of this deep dive. When we see that massive spike in widows on paper between 1880 and 1950, we aren't looking at a plague.
No.
We are looking at abandoned wives, separated women, and unmarried mothers who found the only loophole in a system designed to crush them.
It was a widespread, quiet rebellion born out of the innate human drive to exist.
But a society can't function forever with thousands of its citizens living under assumed legal identities. How did Coverture finally break? Because it didn't just vanish overnight.
No, it was an agonizingly slow crawl to liberty. Before there was sweeping nationwide legal reforms, individual women had to fight the system case by case.
How so?
Well, if your husband was squandering your family's assets, your only official recourse was the right of petition.
Imagine the humiliation of that, having to draft a formal letter, stand before a legislature composed entirely of men, and beg for a private act of divorce.
Or plead to be granted special theme sole trader status, just so you could legally keep the $3 you earned scrubbing floors.
It's degrading.
It was degrading. But those individual heartbreaking petitions eventually forced lawmakers to confront the absurdity of the system. The systemic reform began to take shape.
Right.
A massive ideological turning point was the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention.
Ah, okay.
There, activists drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, which explicitly and publicly challenged the legal doctrine of coverture, demanding that women be recognized as autonomous citizens.
And practically, we start seeing the passage of the Married Women's Property Acts. The sources highlight that Mississippi actually kicked things off early in 1839. Then New York followed with landmark laws in 1848 and 1860. These acts finally began to dismantle coverture, allowing married women to own property separately from their husbands, manage their own wages, and enter into contracts.
And it is worth noting the mechanics of why some of these early laws passed.
Yeah, why Mississippi?
In places like Mississippi, the driving force wasn't necessarily a sudden embrace of feminist equality. It was often wealthy plantation owners who realized that if they left large inheritances to their daughters under coverture, that wealth instantly belonged to their sons-in-law.
Oh, so if the son-in-law was dissipated?
The family fortune was lost. So, ironically, the patriarchy passed property laws to protect its own assets, which inadvertently began securing rights for women.
That is a fascinating historical mechanism.
Isn't it?
But what about the children? Because earlier we established that under coverture, children were strictly the property of the father. If property laws were shifting, did custody laws shift too?
They did, and it required a massive shift in judicial logic. As Victorian ideals began heavily emphasizing the unique sacred bond between a mother and her child, judges found it increasingly difficult to justify tearing nursing infants away from their mothers simply to satisfy an 11th century property law.
So they changed it.
So the courts adopted the tender years doctrine.
Meaning they recognized that young children physically and emotionally needed their mothers more than they needed to be classified as a father's asset.
Exactly. The Custody of Infants Act of 1839 allowed mothers, for the first time, to petition for custody, but only for children under 7 years old.
Just 7.
Just 7. But the logic slowly expanded. By the 1873 Act, that age was raised to 16. But true, equal parental footing took decades longer. It wasn't until the Guardianship of Infants Act of 1925 that equal rights for both parents were finally codified.
1925. My grandparents were alive in 1925.
Yeah, it's very recent.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? When we step back and look at this entire journey, we are drawing a direct, unbroken line from the desperation of a silenced femme covert in 1850, trapped by medieval Norman laws, to the legal landscape we live in right now. The fact that a married woman today has a bank account in her own name, the ability to initiate a no-fault divorce, and equal legal guardianship of her own children, that is not ancient history. That is a relatively recent, fiercely hard-won victory.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
The shadows of coverture lingered well into the 20th century. The liberty, the fundamental recognition of personhood that we take completely for granted today, was fought for inch by agonizing inch, often by women whose names were never recorded by history.
Let's bring this all together. We started our deep dive by stepping off a ship into the muddy, intensely male-dominated chaos of Gold Rush San Francisco.
Right.
A place where the sheer scarcity of women upended society so thoroughly that polite men supposedly hired the Pony Express just to find dance partners.
Yeah.
We explored the suffocating ventriloquist act of coverture where a married woman was legally erased, and we contrasted that with the shocking legal superpowers of the single femme soul.
Which is such a crazy contrast.
And finally, we uncovered the brilliant subversive use of the widow's mask, how thousands of abandoned wives used a tragic social title as a shield against a patriarchal legal system, forging new lives from scratch.
It is a profound testament to human resilience. When the legal framework of your country denies your very existence, you don't just disappear. You find a way to exist anyway.
Which leaves me with one final provocative thought for you to mull over after this deep dive ends. We all have family trees.
Yeah, most of us do.
And if you dig back far enough, you probably have census records sitting in a shoebox or pulled up on a genealogy website right now.
Definitely.
Given everything we've just explored about the crushing stigma of divorce, the trap of 19th century marriage, and the sheer survival instinct of these women.
Look loosely at those records.
Exactly. Go look at your own family tree. When you trace your finger down that faded paper and see the word widowed written in elegant script next to your great-great-grandmother's name, ask yourself, Was she actually a grieving wife?
Oh.
Or was she a brilliant, resourceful woman who pulled off the ultimate legal magic trick to seize her own liberty?
It certainly makes you read your own history in a completely different light.
It really does. Until next time.